it's Lisa. I want to share with you how I did several of my Christmas cards this year. I made 50 of these cards, actually this one, for a card swap. And after I mailed the very last card, I decided that I would like to do a video. So I've made some more. And this one uses a lot of watercolors as well as a little bit of stamping supplies. I'm moving more and more to watercolors, but I still want to utilize my stamping supplies. I'm showing you this one, but I'm also showing you some that are kind of a hybrid where I'm using some stamping supplies and some watercolors, and then one card where I don't use watercolors at all. Everything is with stamps and inks. So let's look at what I used to make the card and how I made it. Let's go over supplies. This is going to look like a lot of supplies for one card, but if you have been doing cards, scrapbooking, any kind of paper craft for any length of time, you probably have all of these things or many of them. All right, we're going to need a punch or something to draw a circle with, and I'm going to use a punch, but you could use anything to draw a small circle. We're going to do some embossing, and let's look at the stamps we'll use. We just need something to go on to create a design on our ornaments, and I'm using the swirl stamp, and the size swirl I use in here will depend on what works with the 1.5 inch punch. This is a really, really old set from a company called Scrappy Cat, and I put it in this jewel case myself years ago, but anything that would create a pretty design, or you can leave that part off altogether if you like. I'm going to do 2 different cards, and one of them will have the branches painted on, and the other one will be stamped and maybe with a little bit extra painting. This is an old set from Stampin' Up called Kindred Spirits that does sort of a little branch design, but anything that created that would work fine as well. And of course you'll need a little bit of ink to work with that. You'll need cardstock and designer paper. The great thing about this card is that you don't have to use traditional colors. So this was a good way for me to use down some of my stash of pattern paper and cardstock that were not Christmassy colors necessarily, but that I just, had a lot of. If we're doing embossing, we'll need some embossing powder, and I'm going to use silver. For my card, that's what I found looked the best. You could use gold, of course. I didn't think the clear worked really well. And then, of course, embossing tools, Versamark, your embossing buddy, or something to remove the static on the paper. And then we will be working with some watercolors. Now, I have some professional watercolors because I've really kind of gotten into this, but I started with this really inexpensive set that I got at Hobby Lobby, and that works fine too. I don't know where that one went, but this particular set works just great. So any kind of watercolors that you have, and of course brushes and water and all that. All right, so let's get started with the first step of the card, which is to punch a hole that we're going to use to guide the circle that we'll draw. And if you're doing a bunch of cards, then you can just use this over and over and over again. Oh, and I didn't mention the watercolor paper and these markers. I've got a silver marker that I think looks really nice with it, or gold would work as well. But if you don't have that, you can just use a regular, ordinary gray or yellow marker. I have 2 different kinds of watercolor paper that I'm working on because I'm going to show you 2 different cards. One is Arches 100% cotton paper. That is kind of the gold standard in watercolor from what I can tell. And it does really great with the paints, but when you stamp on this, it has a lot of texture, and it doesn't pick up the stamp quite as well as a really smooth cardstock or smoother cardstock like some of the cheaper. This is the Canton that you can get at Michael's and most any art supply store that's really cheap practice kind of paper. But it does a great job. In fact, let me show you some of the first ones that I experimented with. I got some really great deep colors working on this inexpensive paper. It just created a little bit of a chalky texture to them. So I ended up using a little bit nicer quality papers when I made my actual cards, but this works also. So we'll do some of both, and you'll see how it does. So let's start by marking our circle. Just going to try to mark really lightly And I can always erase if I get a little bit too dark. And I've positioned the circle, the ornament, so it's a little bit to the left. And then I'll put my greeting on the right side. Okay, I'm going to go over these with the embossing buddy and stamp with Versamark, and then I'll add my silver embossing powder. This is some I got from one of the craft stores, I think maybe Michael's, I don't know, I've had it quite a while. I usually use Stampin' Up! Embossing powder, but I just ran out of the silver, but this works fine. Now, you'll notice the paper towel up at the top of the screen. That's where I have covered up, I've closed my watercolor tray and I've covered what exposed watercolors I had. If you're working with powders, you really want to make sure your watercolors are away from your surface or covered up good so that you don't get any of this powder mixed into that. And then I'll heat these. And they look really pretty. You can see that silver shows up very well. I'm using a size 6 brush. Use whatever size you're comfortable with. The first couple of cards I'm going to do here, I'm going to work with watercolors, and then I'm going to show you how to do this with ink. So with watercolors, I've decided to do a wet on dry technique. I've tried this with wet on wet where you wet the circle and then drop the color in. I found I got a better color just doing a wet on dry technique. And I usually used 2 colors for each one. So I'd kind of do one side, in this case, in more of the teal color and the other side in a blue, and then kind of blended them together. But you could do as many colors as you want or just do one color all over. You do want to make sure you go in around your embossed image. It's easy to kind of miss the spots around the embossed image, so be sure and get those in. And I tried to make the outside edges a little bit darker and have some lighter area inside the circle for some highlight. Now the first one was the Arches paper, that's going to stay wet quite a while. You really can work with the image on the Arches paper. This paper is going to dry a little bit faster, but it's still going to have a nice look to it. This is a cheaper paper, but it'll still work very well. Okay. In fact, you can see it ends up actually being just a tad darker. I struggle to keep things perfectly round, even when I've drawn in a circle. Okay. And I'm drying my brush off or cleaning my brush off and then pulling a little bit of color out of the middle of each of these to give it a little bit more highlight so it's a little darker on the edges. Now I want to show you how you can do this with ink if you don't have watercolors. These are Distress Oxide inks which give you a good rich ink and they stay wet quite a while. You could use other regular types of ink if you wanted to. And I'm going to mark a circle here and we'll just try a couple of the Distress Oxides. I had the Peacock color. I don't know why I didn't use it because it would have been similar to the watercolors. You could really see how they compared. But I've got Pistachio and I think it's Tumbled Glass. Now this is not going to spread nearly as well as watercolors. It's going to take more ink to do this. You won't get quite the blending, but you can still have a nice effect. And I hadn't done an embossed image here, but I could have worked over an embossed image just as well. It's just another way of getting the color on the paper. Now, since we're working with the stamping products, I'm going to start this first one here with a stamped image. And I happen to also be using Distress Oxide. And this one is more important to use something like Distress Oxide that stays wet because I'm going to blend in some additional color here. If you use a regular stamping ink like Stampin' Up! Ink or the regular Distress inks, they're going to dry almost instantly when they hit the paper. And you're not going to be able to blend. So I'm going to add a little bit of ink to my block. Couple of these colors and just kind of blend those in, and this will help me fill in the design a little bit and it makes it look a little more hand done rather than stamped.
Also helps fill in where when you stamp an image on watercolor paper, it doesn't quite make as pretty an impression as it does on really smooth paper. I could also use a brown ink and do the branch and kind of paint that in if I wanted to. It would just be another option to make it even more realistic looking. Now, I can mix watercolors in with this. It doesn't have to all be just ink. So I have some watercolor paint over here on my palette, and I'm just going to use that along with the distress paint, or the distress ink, because remember the distress oxide inks stay wet for a while. So I'm blending in some watercolors. And now I'm adding in a little bit of the brown. I'm using a pretty small brush here to do this, size 2 brush. It's easy to get into all those details with that. So this is a little painting, a little stamping. And it just looks really customized in the design. This is the way I did them last year. The next one you'll see was this year's version. Last year I did these for my family and friends cards, and then this year I did them for my swap cards. And so this year I did more watercolor painting as I progressed with that a little bit. But last year I really hadn't started doing much with watercolors, so I did more of these techniques where I used some watercolors and I used some stamps and kind of filled in like I'm doing here. I think they were still pretty cards. In fact, I think I used gelatos actually to make the color on the ornaments last year. So there's a lot of different ways you could add that color. All right, now we're going to do the pure watercolor technique, which is I'm making like the tree branch, a little spruce. Come down with some brown, and then using my size 6 brush, I'm picking up some green paint. I think that's sap green, and I may have added just a little bit of blue-green to it. And then I'm just going to flick in some very fine little needles for the branches. Now, I am not a watercolor artist. I am just learning, but I will link in a couple of other people's videos that I really like on doing this kind of thing in the description. So if you're interested in more watercolor stuff, there are other watercolor artists that do Em Lefebvre, and Ellen Creamy Trent, I think is her name. They do some great stuff, and I've watched a lot of their videos, and I will link some of those in for you to see if you're interested in doing more with actual watercolor painting. Because I am definitely still a novice, but I enjoy doing it. And adding some extra little needles in a blue-green, doing 2 different shades, I think makes it look really pretty. All right, now it's time to put tops on our ornaments. So this is where I'm using my little silver marker. And you could also just use a regular gray marker for those. And then I'm using a real fine line, and this happens to be a brown marker, to go up and draw the string. And I've seen people use rulers to do theirs. I think I used a ruler last year when I did mine. This year I just hand did them, tried to make it straight. Okay. And the line for this one kind of has to go up to nothing because my branch didn't quite connect with my ornament. All right, we're down to the last 2 steps. I need a greeting. And I've got my watercolors covered up again because I'm going to do something messy here in a minute. All right, I'm going to stamp a greeting on one of them, and the other one I'm going to do some writing as well as stamping. So that Peace, Joy, and Love comes out of a set that I've sort of flipped over to the side there. Oh, there. No, that's not it. There, I'll have to put it on the screen which set it was. This was out of a birthday set, and it's just the word to you because I'm going to write in joy, And then I'm going to stamp in to you. And that was what I did on most of the cards that I made this year. Okay. All right, and the only thing this particular part of the card needs is a little bit of misting, essentially. I don't have mists anymore, so not, if you had mist, you could just mist it. But I'm going to use some Perfect Pearls from Ranger, and I'm mixing it with water. Not a lot of water, just a little bit of water. And there again, you do want to cover these things up, get them out of the way, because it's really easy to spill these powders. But Perfect Pearls can be used with a lot of different things, and they can basically create a mist. So I've got them on an old paintbrush, and then I'm just going to sprinkle them over my paper, and it will create a little silver dots, a little silver mist over the watercolors, and I think that makes it look really nice and slightly casual to it, and just adds a little bit of extra sparkle. And here are our completed cards. You can see that little sprinkle of silver there on this one that we did with inks. And then one that was sort of a hybrid of watercolors and stamps. Really good vibrant color to it. I added a little bit of ribbon, and the designer papers are not Christmas papers. They're just some extra designer papers I had. And then this one with a little bit of additional watercolor painting. So thanks for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and happy holidays.